Good morning or good afternoon, my fellow tech heads. So, for anyone looking at getting started with a Microsoft certification, you can start out by going to microsoft.com/learning. At this page, you'll see many different options. What we will be looking at today is the various different types of certifications that you can acquire, such as server, desktop, database, or even cloud or developer. Starting out as an IT professional, you might want to start with the desktop certification, which will give you a nice little leg up if you go be a help desk, knock, or desktop support specialist, what have you. As far as today, I'm going to take us through the Windows Server certifications. All right. Now, one of the cool things about Windows Server training, you can come here and they can give you nice little introductions and various other videos and learning Windows Server stuff. If you come down here at the bottom, you'll see training for Windows Server certifications. It shows you entry-level IT infrastructure, which is the MTA certification exams. I've actually never seen anyone get any of these, but it's kind of a good entry into the Windows Server and Windows and Microsoft in general. The associate levels, Server 2012 and 2016, are the two we're going to be focusing on today. Once you look at getting your associate level, then you can move on to the expert level. In the case of Server 2016, we are looking at the Microsoft Certified Solutions Associate exam. When you come in here to the associate exam, you'll notice that we have 3 exams that are required in order to earn your MCSA. The Installation, Storage, and Compute with Windows Server 2016, Networking with Windows Server 2016, and Identity Services with Windows Server 2016. Each of the exams, the 7740, 7741, and the 7742 exams, we'll be looking at the 7740 today and the 7742. The reason we look at both of these is because, traditionally I like to start with Active Directory. The installation, storage, and compute is nice to start with, but any environment you ever work with is going to have domain services. So the 7742 exam was published back in 2016 and is available in multiple languages. Luckily enough, you can take this in English, Spanish, Chinese, French, German, Japanese, and Portuguese. Now this is for the Windows Server 2016 technology, and it is a credit toward one of the 3 exams for the MCSA Server 2016. As you see here with the identity services, we'll be coming down here to the skills measured, and you'll notice first and foremost, Active Directory. Like I mentioned before, one of the things about server infrastructures is we kind of have to start with identity. You really want to have that centralized management for all of your users, all of your policies for your workstations, certificates for security, and of course, federation and access solutions for those outside your organization. If we click here on Install and Configure Active Directory Domain Services, you'll notice that this is a 20 to 25%, which basically means probably about a quarter of all your questions are probably going to be based on installing and configuring ADDS. First thing we look at is the installation and configuration of domain controllers. This objective may include, but is not limited to, the installation of a new forest, the addition or removal of a domain controller from a domain, the upgrading of a domain controller, installing ADDS on server core, which is a cool new feature they came out with recently, kind of like a Linux-esque server core where you don't have a GUI. You'll notice that when we look at the installation for Windows Server, you'll have 2 options, GUI or no GUI. We're going to be looking at installing a domain controller from Install from Media, or IFM, which is a really nice option if you don't want to have to worry about replication across the network. We'll look at resolving DNS SRV record registration issues, configuring global catalog servers, the transfer and seizing of operations master roles, the installation and configuration of RODCs, or read-only domain controllers, and of course, domain controller cloning. We will then create and manage Active Directory users and computers, the place where you put all of your users and computers for authentication purposes. Every user and computer is going to have an object in Active Directory. We'll be looking at the automation and creation of Active Directory accounts, create, copy, configure, and delete users and computers. We will configure templates, perform bulk Active Directory operations, basically a nice way of adding a lot of users or a lot of computers at once without having to do each individually. We'll be looking at configuring users' rights, implementing offline domain joins, and managing inactive and disabled accounts. We'll also automate unlocking of disabled accounts and the automation of password resets, which in the past you'll know that passwords have always been call the help desk kind of scenario. We will then create and manage Active Directory groups and organizational units to be able to kind of group all of our users and computers based on access control, policies, and other various items. We will be configuring group nesting, converting groups, including security, distribution, universal, domain, local, and global style groups, and how those all work together. We will manage group membership using group policy. We will enumerate group memberships of users and computers. We will then automate group membership management using Windows PowerShell. We will delegate the creation and management of Active Directory groups no use. That way we can kind of give help desk or junior administrators the ability to kind of do a lot of these management tasks engineers really don't want to do anymore. And then we will manage default Active Directory containers. We will then create, copy, configure, and delete groups and OUs. Now for the install and configure Active Directory services, that's a nice little start. And then we'll move into managing and maintaining of Active Directory and domain services. You'll notice that this is a 15 to 20%. We'll be configuring service authentication and providing account policies. With this, we'll be creating and configuring service accounts, creating and configuring group managed service accounts. We will then configure Kerberos constrained delegation. We will then manage service principal names, configure virtual accounts, configure domain and local user password policy settings, and configure and apply password settings objects. Delegate password setting management, configuring lockout policy settings, Kerberos policy settings with group policy. We will configure authentication policies and authentication policy silos. When we get into maintaining Active Directory, we'll look at backing up AD and the sysvol volume. We will manage Active Directory offline, perform offline defragmentation of Active Directory databases, clean up metadata, and configure Active Directory snapshots. We will then perform object and container level recovery, perform Active Directory restore. This is to configure and restore objects using Active Directory recycle bin. We'll also configure replication to RODCs, which will need the password replication policy. And then we will monitor and manage replication. We'll learn how to upgrade the sysvol replication to a distributed file system replication, or DFSR. We will then configure Active Directory in a complex enterprise environment. Here we will look at a multi-domain and multi-forest Active Directory infrastructure. This will allow us to deploy Windows Server 2016 domain controllers with pre-existing AD environments, upgrade existing domains and forests, configure domain and forest functional levels, and we'll also look at what the various functional levels provide for us. We will configure multiple user principal name suffixes. We will configure external, forest, shortcut, and realm trusts between Active Directory domains. We will then configure trust authentication, SID filtering, name suffix routing, and sites and subnets. After this, we will create and configure site links, manage site coverage, manage registration of SRV records, and move domain controllers between sites. As you can see so far, just these two separate skills is really hard. Kind of a lot to take in, really. After we look at the various Active Directory domain service, management, maintenance, installation, and configuration, we will create and manage the group policies. Now the group policies, as I mentioned before, is kind of a way to give policies to users and computers. Now we have the specific settings that will go along with users and computers, but we will also have the ability to configure group policy preferences. In addition to those, we'll be able to create and manage group policy objects. The objective may include, but is not limited to, the configuration of a central store, making starter GPOs, configure GPO links, configure multiple local GPO policies, backup, import, copy, and restore GPOs, create and configure a migration table, reset default GPOs, delegate group policy management, detect health issues using group policy infrastructure status page, configure group policy processing, configure processing order and precedence, configure blocking of inheritance, configure enforced policies, configure security filtering and Windows management instrumentation filtering, configure loopback processing, configure and manage slow link processing and group policy caching, configure client-side extension behavior, CSE, and force a group policy update on a target host or user. We will then configure group policy settings. We'll configure software installation, folder redirection, scripts, administrative templates. We can import existing security templates. We can import a custom administrative template file and configure filtering for administrative templates, and configure filtering for an administrative template. Lastly, we can configure group policy preferences. We can configure printer preferences, define network mappings, configure power options, configure custom registry settings, configure control panel settings, Internet Explorer settings, configure file and folder deployment, configure shortcut deployment, and configure item level targeting. Here we finish up the create and manage of group policy, which is also 25 to 30% of the total questions asked. Next, we go into implementing Active Directory certificate services. For this objective, we're going to install Active Directory Integrated Enterprise Certificate Authority, or CA. We'll install an offline root and then subordinate CAs. We'll install standalone CAs, configure certificate revocation lists, or CRL distribution points, install and configure online responders, implement administrative role separation, and configure CA backup and recovery. Now with Active Directory certificate services, we have to manage certificates, manage certificate templates, implement and manage certificate deployment, validation, and revocation, manage certificate renewal, manage certificate enrollment and renewal, manage certificate enrollment and renewal for computers and users using group policies, and configuring and managing key archival and recovery, all while configuring and managing key archival and recovery. The next item we see is implement identity federation and access solutions. Here we will install and configure Active Directory federation services. We are going to upgrade and migrate previous ADFS workloads to Windows Server 2016, implement claims-based authentication, including relying party trusts, configure authentication policies, configure multi-factor authentication, implement and configure device registration, integrate ADFS with Microsoft's Passport, configure the use with Microsoft Azure and Office 365, as well as configure ADFS to enable authentication of users stored in LDAP directories. We will then implement web application proxies, where we'll install and configure WAP, implement WAP in pass-through mode, implement WAP as ADFS proxy, integrate WAP with ADFS, configure ADFS requirements, publish web apps via WAP, publish remote desktop gateway applications, configure HTTP to HTTPS redirects, create internal and external FQDNs. And lastly in this series, we will look at installing and configuring Active Directory rights management services. We will install a licensor certificate, ADRMS server, manage ADRMS service connection points, or SCP, manage ADRMS templates, configure exclusion policies, and backup and restore RDMS. I hope this introduction at least has been a little bit useful for you, and I hope you join for the rest of my video series.